Hi, this is Brian Kim. I want to share with you this case of a patient who was referred to me. This patient had a dislocated single piece acrylic lens in the sulcus. And this patient, again, was having glaucoma issues with his eye, blurry vision. And he's just noticed progressively over time that he's having more trouble with pressure as well as vision. And so he was referred for a dislocated IOL evaluation. And what I noticed was this patient has a single piece of acrylic lens in the sulcus, most likely contributing to his glaucoma. But he also has a pretty small pupil. And so as I'm trying to take this lens out, obviously with a small pupil, then the pupil gets even smaller because I'm touching the iris. And so you're going to see my modified Yamane technique by externalizing the leading haptic through a contralateral limbal incision, thereby making the trailing haptic much more easy to execute because the optics is pushed away. And I'm using this in a sensor lens, a 3-piece sensor lens, PMA haptics, but it's okay, it doesn't matter. I'm able to cannulate both haptics into the needle and pull them out. And you're going to see this case from beginning to end here. So you can see this patient has a lens. It's decentered inferiorly. I'm sitting supratemporal. I always mark before I make my incisions. Why? Because if you make your incisions, then the eye will be wet. And being wet and getting good marks don't go together. So you have to have a super dry eye. So make sure the eye is completely dry. Marking the limbus on the right side and then the left side, and using the cannula shaft to find 180 degrees apart. These are the fixed calipers. I go 2.5 millimeters posterior to the limbus in radial fashion, and then 2 millimeters adjacent. Again, I'm drying the eye with a Wexel sponge, and then using the 27 gauge cannula that's already been inked, and then I'm able to get these beautifully discrete ink marks on the conjunctiva. I do the same thing on the left side. Again, indenting 2.5 millimeters with a fixed caliper in radial fashion behind that limbal mark, and then 2 millimeters adjacent. Again, you want to make sure the surface is nice and dry, and then using that 25 gauge cannula that's already been inked and marking the conjunctiva. And so now I'm ready to go. I got nice marks. And this patient has not had a vitrectomy, and I know I'm going to have to do it. So this is the 23 gauge trocar. I indent the sclera. And then I'm going to tunnel with the trocar needle, tunneling about 2.5 millimeters, tunnel, and then rotating perpendicular and then stabbing through. You know this is going to be a self-sealing trocar incision because the trocar is sitting sideways. Using the cotton tip's much better at controlling the eye. I make my paracentesis incision contralateral to my limbal incision, which is again 90 degrees to my marks, the conj marks. And then I make my incision on the left side and then the right side. These are the incisions to help me explant the lens. And then that last incision is for the AC maintainer. Go ahead and push some more epinephrine. See if I can make that pupil a little bit bigger because it is a little small. Didn't really do anything, unfortunately. And this is the dispersive viscoelastic to coat the corneal endothelium. And if there's any vitreous, it'll help pushes any potential vitreous out of the way so I can take this lens out. So I'm holding the eye with that cannula, and then I make my 3 millimeter incision. Using 2 forceps, go ahead and pull that lens up into the anterior chamber. Because this is that gummy lens material, you can have the IOL holder in one hand and just a smooth forcep on the other side. It's going to hold it very well. This is in contrast to like a silicone lens, which is very slippery. So you wouldn't be able to do that if you had smooth forceps. But with this gummy acrylic material, it's pretty easy to grasp it. And then I'm going to fold the haptic and tuck it so I can pop the entire lens into the anterior chamber. And you saw how I was using the forceps to position the lens in such a way that I'm able to cut it the way I want to. And how do I cut it? I bisect the optic completely in half, but I want to make sure I cut just to the left of the right side haptic. You saw that? So I cut on the left side of the right side haptic. And why do I do it that way? So that I can take the right side piece, and because of the way I cut it, I can grab that optic edge, and that right side haptic will collapse on itself. So the optic and haptic is in like a V configuration, and it's able to collapse on itself. I'm grabbing the apex of the V, and I'm able to pull it out. See, if I grab the apex of the left side, it's an upside down V, and it's going to hook the eye. The haptic would act like a fish hook, and you don't want to do that. And so instead of just trying to pull it out straight, I'm rotating that left side piece 180 degrees, grabbing the cut edge of the optic, which then creates it a V-shaped configuration. I'm grabbing the apex of the V, and as I pull, the haptic collapses on itself, and I use my second instrument always to protect the corneal endothelium as I do this. So very efficient and easy way and systematic way to cut a single piece of acrylic lens out. And here I do the pars plana vitrectomy, and I have my 22 gauge AC maintainer, thin-walled AC maintainer, which fits through a standard paracentesis incision. I love that AC maintainer, works very well. Do the vitrectomy primarily over where I'm going to place my needles. Again, those are going to be under the conj marks. That first needle, the blue needle, is a 25 gauge needle for externalizing the leading haptic. Make sure the bevel is facing to the right. That second needle is the 30 gauge thin wall needle for my right side needle, and I bend it also about 9 millimeters from the tip, again facing towards me. And the left side needle is bent at the hub. It's going to face away from me. That's the cartridge for the Sensar lens. I fill it with viscoelastic. Place the lens into the cartridge. Make sure the optic is going to collapse concavely. The leading haptic goes into the barrel. The trailing haptic goes out through the back. As I place the cartridge into the injector, you want to make sure the trailing haptic is above and out of the barrel. And then I'm able to push it, and it goes right in. So I'm ready to go. All right, 25 gauge needle through the contralateral limbal incision. The bevel's facing to the right. My assistant is going to start delivering the lens. I tell her to stop, and then I'm able to dock the haptic on the bevel needle. She goes ahead and proceeds with delivering the lens. And once the leading haptic's out, I ask her to stop, and then I take over. So the leading haptic is completely out, sweeping the trailing haptic to the right side, and the optic is starting to open up. Push some dispersive viscoelastic to coat the cornea and push the optic back. Go ahead and start with the right side needle, stabbing the conjunctiva and sclera at that first mark, and I'm going to tunnel 2 millimeters. In this case, the AC maintainer did get in my way just a little bit, and so for the future, maybe position that incision further away, closer towards the leading haptic where that is. Yeah, I kind of lost my orientation about how far I was. So I had to pull back out, and then I tunneled 2 millimeters, and then I dove back in. So again, very carefully, grasping the haptic with smooth forceps. First, I'm going to, yeah, that's a good idea. Just go ahead and pull that leading haptic so it causes the optic to go away from me. And then I was able to grasp that trailing haptic very carefully. I'm docking the haptic on the bevel of the needle. And in this case, I had the bevel facing towards the microscope a little bit, which is not how I normally do it. Again, I was playing with my angles just to see if that would make it easier. But all that did was it made it a little bit more difficult. So I normally have the bevel facing the incision. And by doing it that way, I'm able to flatten it and then guide it in. And so what you see me doing here is I'm slightly pronating my hand with the, right here. See, I pronated my right hand so that the bevel is actually pointed down more. So it's just a slight repositioning of that needle, pronating my hand, turning that bevel down more towards iris plane. And then now I'm able to flatten the haptic on the bevel of the needle, and then it goes right in. And so that's a very subtle point, but it's very, very important. And how you bend the needle and how you actually have the bevel inside the eye and with respect to the haptic is very important. So everyone has their different ways of doing it. For me, what works best is making sure that bevel is facing the approach of the haptic, which means it needs to be down more at iris plane and not towards the microscope. All right, so internalize the leading haptic, grasping the incision, placing the needle at that first mark, stabbing the conj and the sclera, tunneling 2 millimeters, and then diving down. All right, so I feel really good about that. Got good resistance. I felt like I got a good scleral shelf. So hopefully the optic doesn't sag, and hopefully it's going to be well centered. So this is a trick. This is a smallish pupil. I could have put iris hooks. And truth is, if you are new to this technique, put iris hooks in, okay, just to give yourself better visibility. But I've done this technique with the sensor multiple times, so I feel pretty good about what I'm doing. And if you feel like you don't have a good angle or a good grip, you can just re-grab. That's the beauty of doing it this way, because the haptic is in the angle. The leading haptic is in the angle. So I'm going to go ahead and dock the haptic on the bevel of the needle. You see it's kind of slipping, and that's because I'm not aligned properly, okay? So now I'm going to, try again, dock the haptic on the bevel of the needle, gently flatten it, so yeah, whenever I miss the needle, when I'm trying to engage the needle with the haptic, that means I'm not aligned. So finally I was able to get it aligned, and then it just went right in. Again, you don't need too much. You don't have to feed it, because again, with this PMMA haptic, it tends to stay within the needle very well. It doesn't slip out. So I have a lot of confidence. Go ahead and start pulling that left side needle out, pulling it towards me, having the forceps ready to grab the haptic as it comes out. Go ahead and cauterize the tip. I had some water there, so it didn't really cauterize properly. So always want to make sure it's dry when you cauterize. Done with that side, and then do the same thing on the right side. I'm pulling the right side needle away from me and very carefully trying to grasp the haptic as it comes out with the forceps. Cauterize the tip. But one thing you'll notice is, I'm trying to turn the water off. You saw that I kind of decompressed the eye with the cautery tip, but it caused an asymmetric flange, a little bit of a funny looking flange. So now I'm going to use a Wexel sponge and really dry the eye. And once it's dry, go ahead and cauterize again, a little bit of a better flange. So there you go. So now you'll see nice symmetrical haptics flat to the sclera. I don't have the flagpole sign. You want to push the haptics flat to the sclera and then reapproximate the conjunctiva. I'm closing the main incision with a 10-0 nylon suture. I always do that on these cases because even though you do a great job with doing vitrectomy, you never know, you might end up with a straggler of a strand, and that's kind of the most annoying thing in my experience. Go ahead and do some more vitrectomy. A limbal vitrectomy here. Part of that is just to remove any viscoelastic as well, but also to make sure there's no funny strands trying to come around the pupil and trying to come to any of my incisions. So now I switch sides, and now I'm going to do the vitrector PI, turning the port down, get a nice discrete PI. Again, I don't want to go all the way into the angle because you might eat the ciliary body and cause hemorrhage, but you want to be about 1 millimeter shy of the peripheral angle, and you get a beautiful PI. Go ahead and using the vitrector, switch to cortex mode, removing all the viscoelastic from the anterior chamber and on the cornea, and I'm using the BSS cannula to pulse that viscoelastic off the cornea and out of the angle. And then I'm going to hydrate my incisions here. We'll end up taking the trocar out, and you'll notice as I take the trocar out that it's a nice self-sealing incision. Again, I know this because I spent a lot of time tunneling through the sclera with the trocar needle before I dive down. If you don't do it that way, you're going to have a leaky incision, and then you're going to have to do a conch cut down. You're going to have to close the sclerotomy. It's just kind of a pain in the butt. But you'll see here with my technique, I don't really tend to have that trouble. So grabbing the trocar cannula out, massaging the eye, turning irrigation on right there, and lo and behold, a nice firm globe, no ballooning of the sclerotomy. So that's good to go. Take out my 22 gauge thin-walled AC maintainer, and I love that AC maintainer because it does not leak. The incision doesn't leak. With the other 20 gauge Lewicki, it leaked a lot. Very annoying. I had to close the incision. With this one, because it's smaller, I don't have that problem, but because it has a thin-walled lumen, I get excellent infusion pressure for this technique. Go ahead and hydrate the incisions, and that's the end of the case. So again, this is a patient who had a dislocated single-piece acrylic lens. It was hard to know where it was because there was very little capsule. Presumably, it was causing UGG syndrome. The patient had glaucoma issues as well as vision issues. Went ahead and took the lens out and performed Yamane technique. Again, in this case, I want to highlight the fact that you have to align the haptic and the needle. Remember, the needle does not bend, the haptic can. So you have to dock the haptic on the bevel of the needle and then flatten out the haptic so it's more straight, and then you can feed the haptic into the needle. You can't make the needle bend. It just won't. It's made of metal. So the haptic you can flatten out, you can manipulate it very gently. But as I've told you, I like to have the bevel facing the approach of the haptic. And that way you can flatten out that haptic, make it straighter, and then you're able to feed it into that needle. Again, with this Sensar lens, the PMMA haptic, and that 30 gauge thin wall needle, it really grips the haptic so well. I've never had the haptic slip out as I pulled the needles out. I have tremendous confidence that the haptic will stay in that needle throughout all the manipulation. And as you saw in this very small pupil case, illustrating the point of, again, flattening the haptic on the bevel of the needle, and you'll be able to thread the needle and then execute the Yamane technique. So I hope this was helpful to you, and I thank you for your attention.